little bit on the background there. Those boxes, you can look at that. What's the situation in Galatians? They're departing from the gospel very soon after they've been converted. Why are they departing from the gospel? Because secondly, outside teachers have come in and bewitched them. Thirdly, I am going fast here. I usually go slower at this part, but you can read the letter yourself, right? Thirdly, what's the theology of the people who misled them? They're typically called Judaizers. That's contested today, whether we should call them Judaizers, but I think that's a right designation. What did they teach? Well, this is kind of like 2 Corinthians. First, they taught Paul's not a true apostle. There we go again, right? Paul's not really an apostle. Same kind of thing again. Is he one of the 12? Did he walk and talk with Jesus? Right? Paul's life wasn't always easy. They said his gospel comes from people, not from God. Actually, he distorted the gospel to please you. He's a people pleaser. Because he didn't want to tell you, you got to get circumcised. And that doesn't excite people, right? To hear that. What do you have to do to belong to God? You got to be circumcised. Who's preaching the tough gospel here? Not Paul. Not Paul. And the apostles in Jerusalem do not agree with him. That's their argument. So secondly, you must observe the Old Testament law and especially circumcision in order to be saved. You must observe the Old Testament law and circumcision to be saved. And that probably referred to the whole law. And I just remembered here, I want to see if I can get this called up first quickly. I want to read you a passage. That I don't think I did this when we did Acts. I want to read you a passage which I think they would have read. So, here's when the Judaizers marched into town, what did they say? And I think this is their favorite Bible passage. And God said to Abraham, Genesis 17, verse 9, "As for you, you shall keep my covenant, you and your offspring, you and your children." How long? Your offspring after you, throughout their generations, forever, right? What is the covenant? "This is my covenant, which you shall keep between me and you and your offspring after you." Is it spiritual? Yes, but it's also physical. "Every male among you shall be circumcised." Oh, that must be spiritual. No, look at verse 11. "You shall be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskins." Can't get away from that, right? Pretty clear. "And it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and you." Judaizers, how are we doing in that area? Not so well. Verse 12. "He who is 8 days old among you shall be circumcised." So you've got to circumcise your kids. "But every male throughout your generations." This doesn't last forever. No, it says throughout your generations. "Whether born in your house or bought with your money from any foreigner who is not of your offspring." How about the foreigners? Yeah, they're to be circumcised too. Verse 13. "Both he who is born in your house and he who is bought with your money shall surely be circumcised. So shall my covenant be in your flesh, an everlasting covenant." That's the verse I think they tweeted, right? "It shall be in your flesh, an everlasting covenant. Any uncircumcised male who is not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin shall be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant." Now look, you guys, you're off to a great start. But become Christians and get circumcised like God's word says. It's sort of like when I first became a believer, an analogy for today, I met a very conservative, there's different kinds of Church of Christ people, right? But I met a very conservative Church of Christ pastor who was not much older than I was, because I was probably 19. I think he was in his early 20s. So he was a young guy. We were talking, and he said to me, he said, "You're not a Christian." I go, "Huh? What?" He goes, "Yeah, you're not a Christian." And I go, "Well, what am I?" He goes, "You're a seeker." And I go, well, how come I'm not a Christian? And he said, you haven't been baptized. And I said, well, I have too been baptized. Got you there. No, you haven't been baptized in our church. So you're not a Christian. I mean, not everybody in the Church of Christ would say that, right? But this movement did say it. I think now that's not a perfect analogy, but I think it's comparable to what these guys were saying, okay? So how does Paul respond to this in his letter? So here's it's a little simpler even than my outline, I think. Yeah, it is a little simpler. Here's a simple way to think of Galatians. First two chapters, Paul defends his apostleship. First two chapters, Paul defends his apostleship. Chapters 3 and 4, he defends his theology. Chapters 5 and 6, he applies his theology. Now, that doesn't fit the verses exactly right, but it's kind of close, you know? It's just a nice way to remember it, because basically that's true, largely. So chapters 1 and 2, he defends his apostleship. Chapters 3 and 4, he defends his theology. Chapter 5 and 6, he applies it. Okay. First of all, he has to defend his apostleship, right? Because there's no use defending your theology if no one believes in you. I mean, you can say what you think all day long if they don't think you're authoritative. So here Paul has to defend himself again and defend the fact that he's a real apostle. Notice from the very first verse, he says, Paul, an apostle, not from man nor through man, right? From the very first verse, he's on the defensive. That he's really an apostle of Jesus Christ. He mentions in the greeting, he mentions Christ's resurrection and that he delivered us, he delivered us from, by his death, he gave himself for us to deliver us from the present evil age. And by the way, I think in mentioning the Christ's death and his resurrection and being delivered from the present evil age, I think he's answered all the objections the Galatians have. He could have closed the letter right there. Do you understand why? Because his argument is the new creation is dawned with the death and resurrection. When the resurrection comes, it's the new creation. Circumcision isn't applicable anymore in the new creation. That was in the old creation. But we're not in the old creation anymore. How do we know? Christ has been raised from the dead. Is there an already not yet? Absolutely. But the new creation's here. And once the resurrection has come, no circumcision. The new creation's at hand. So that's the argument. But he's got to explain it more, right? And he's got to defend himself. So we see in 1:6 through 10, I mentioned this earlier, no thanksgiving. No thanksgiving. Very unusual. Just disturbing. All of Paul's letters begin with a greeting and then a thanksgiving, not this one. A friend of mine told a story where there's the very trivial kind of story, but interesting. They were sitting down to eat lunch, and he said, should we give thanks? And he said, are we thankful? Good question. Well, Paul wasn't thankful. Not for them. Not right then. You know? He was disturbed with them because they were departing from the gospel. And is he trying to please people? No, because what does he tell them in verses 8 and 9? Those who proclaim and those who receive another gospel will be cursed forever. They'll be anathema. They'll be under the ban. In the Old Testament, those who are under the ban are totally destroyed, like Jericho. Remember? That's the word he uses, cherem in the Hebrew, if you know Hebrew. Cherem, anathema, destroyed. So this is no light matter. Paul's not saying, well, we have a little difference here on the millennium or the rapture. So, no, this is huge. This is the gospel that's at stake. But is Paul trying to please people? No, he's definitely not. So I'm moving along fast here. What is Paul's argument? Paul's argument is, look, I got my gospel directly from Jesus on the Damascus road. You think I need the Jerusalem apostles? I do not need them. Paul's not bragging here. But remember, they're saying he got the gospel from Jerusalem and distorted it, right? He's dependent and he's distorted it. You with me? Paul's saying, I'm independent. I'm independent. I got it directly from Jesus on the Damascus Road. I do not need them. I don't need them. I got it directly from Jesus on the Damascus Road. I wasn't taught it by anyone. Jesus Christ revealed himself to me, and that's where I got the gospel. And so his argument is, that explains why I was turned around, brothers and sisters. Don't you remember what I was doing when I was on the way there? I was going up to kill Christians. That's what I devoted my life to, because I thought Christians were so wrong. I was so convinced I was pleasing and serving God and persecuting Christians. That's why I was so hostile to them. And if I wanted to please people, I was the star in Judaism. Everybody looked at me and said, there is the next great rabbi. There he is. Look at him. What a scholar. How zealous. He said, if I wanted to please men, I would have stayed where I was. No, there's only one explanation, and that's that Jesus got a hold of me, and he called me to preach the gospel to the Gentiles. So, that's chapter 1, very quickly. Not dependent, right? Not dependent. Not dependent, not pleasing men. What's chapter 2? What's chapter 2? The story in chapter 2 is not distorted. Not distorted. Not dependent, not distorted. Independent, independently ratified. But so chapter 2, right, he brings Titus to Jerusalem. Titus is a Gentile. There's some people there that say Titus should be circumcised to be saved. Titus is a Greek, right? He's a Gentile. Paul said, no way. Absolutely not. That would compromise the truth of the gospel. Absolutely not. Titus will not be circumcised. What did the Jerusalem apostles do? Remember what Paul's already said in chapter 1. I don't need them. It doesn't matter what they say. It's like what Luther said. It doesn't matter what the Pope says. The gospel is the gospel. And Paul says in chapter 1, it doesn't even matter what I say. Even if I or an angel from heaven preached you another gospel, if it's another gospel, it's wrong, right? So it doesn't matter what the Jerusalem apostles say. But what did they say, Paul says? They shook my hand. They shook the hand of me and Barnabas. These people are lying. Actually, when the Jerusalem apostles heard our gospel, we shook hands on it. So you see how he's building his platform? Independent, but we agree. It's very important practically that they agree, right? On the one hand, it is independent. It's very important that they agree. So important. So, I mean, if the church is fractured like that from the beginning, where would it go? If the apostles disagreed, it'd be a mess, wouldn't it? But it wasn't a mess, because they did agree. That's Paul's point. We shook hands on it. Peter, James, and John gave us the right hand of fellowship. But then Peter came up to Antioch, right? Peter came up to Antioch, and he was having lunch, breakfast, and dinner with the Gentiles. Ham sandwiches, pork chops, bacon, shrimp, scallops, crab, lobster. Well, they were having great meals. Then some people from James came up and said, well, we don't know exactly what they said, but whatever they said, and we'd love many more details here, right? Paul compresses the story down so much. But whatever they said that scared Peter off, right? We're just looking at the big picture here. It scared Peter off, and he quit eating with them. And Paul rebukes Peter in front of everyone. By the way, if you've ever seen the movie Peter and Paul, it's really an old movie, but Anthony Hopkins, Anthony Hopkins, he plays Paul in that movie. Kind of a strange choice, I thought, for Paul. But in the movie, Anthony Hopkins, when this scene comes, he just screams at Peter, just loses his temper. I don't think that's the way it was. I don't think Paul's just lost his temper and just screaming. And of course, in the movie, they have Peter and Paul disagree forever. That's it. They just have a falling out. well, it's kind of Hollywood, but it's also New Testament criticism. But so he rebukes Peter in public. Why doesn't he go through the steps Jesus gave? Right? Doesn't Jesus say reprove somebody privately first? How embarrassing to take him on in front of everybody. But the answer is it's a public sin. Right? It has public consequences. He can't just talk to Peter privately. Everybody's following Peter's example. It can't be, well, Peter. No. Everybody's going that way. It's a public sin that has public consequences. It deserves a public rebuke. So Paul did exactly right. And he says to Peter, you're acting like the false teachers because you're requiring the Gentiles to be Jews. You're requiring the Gentiles to be Jews to be saved. And you don't believe that. That's hypocrisy. That's contrary to what you've been doing. You don't believe that. You're going back on your convictions. And I think Peter agreed because later on, right, 2 Peter 3, Peter salutes Paul's letters as Scripture. Do you see what's happening here, though? What's the point in the story? The point really isn't about Peter and Paul. The point is Paul's gospel has authority over Peter when he goes wrong. Paul's gospel has authority. That's the point. So, independent, chapter 1. Didn't distort the gospel, chapter 2. When we get to chapter 2:15, now he's ready to explain his gospel, right? And what's his gospel? We're not justified by the works of the law, but by faith in Jesus Christ. That's his gospel. Of course, in the new perspective on Paul, works of law are understood to be the boundary markers: circumcision, Sabbath, and food laws. Circumcision, Sabbath, and food laws, and they don't emphasize the whole law. But it's interesting. The new perspective on Paul, at least from my standpoint, I think it's kind of losing some steam. It's not so new anymore. I mean, E.P. Sanders wrote in 1977. Kind of the new perspective is not so new, not quite so sexy and attractive to people as it was, right? So it seems like it's losing some steam to me even, because most people are recognizing it was an exaggerated point. Surely it's true. Paul's concerned about boundary markers. That's true, isn't it? Paul's concerned about the unity of Jew and Gentile in the church. But to say that that's all he has in mind, I think is quite wrong. And by the way, the Roman Catholics argued in their debate with Luther and Calvin that the works of the law referred to basically circumcision, food laws, and Sabbath. Did you know that? You can read the debates. You can read the Roman Catholic side, and Luther and Calvin go back against them. It's not a new debate. And I think Luther and Calvin got the better of the argument then and said, no, it refers to the whole law, not just the boundary markers, not just the ceremonial law. Because you see, you following me? I'm going a little fast. You see that the Roman Catholics want to say you're not justified by the ceremonial law, but you are by the moral law. You see? Get it? Oh, no, you're not justified by whether you observe rituals, but you are justified by whether you're a good person. Paul and James agree. But of course, for Protestants, that's a false gospel, isn't it? And I take it, all of us here would agree. But I just want to say exegetically, to say works of law only refers to ceremonial law or boundary markers, it just doesn't work. And even some of the new perspectivists are kind of coming around and saying, yeah, it really is a little more comprehensive than we've said. So this is the heart of the gospel, isn't it? So quickly, just make some comments from chapters 3 and 4, where we see Paul's theology. He kind of works out what we see in 2:15 through 21. He says, first of all, in 3:1 through 5, how did you receive the Spirit? That's the mark you're a Christian, isn't it? How do you know you're a Christian? In the New Testament, what's the sine qua non? You've got the Spirit, right? That's the mark. How did you receive the Spirit? And Paul says, by doing the law or by hearing with faith? The answer is obvious, isn't it? Hearing with faith. Therefore, you don't have to keep the law and be circumcised to belong to the people of God, because God gave you the Spirit without observing the law. First argument. Second argument, what about Abraham? How was Abraham right with God? Because of his obedience or his faith? Genesis 15:6. Abraham believed God and it was counted to him as righteousness. Therefore, the sons of Abraham are those who have faith. And then the passage we're going to look at, we'll look at again Thursday, 3:10 through 14. I simply want to say the restored Israel, the true Israel, new Israel, if you want to use that language, are the children of Abraham, Jews and Gentiles. Who's the true Israel? Who are the children of Abraham? Paul tells us. Those who believe. So 3:1 through 14, we're justified by faith, not by works. 3:15 and following, Paul argues there, I wish we had time to look at the verses, but what does he argue there? He argues from 3:15, really into chapter 4, the old covenant doesn't last forever. The covenant made at Sinai, the covenant made with Israel at Sinai, is a temporary covenant. God made a covenant that he didn't intend to last forever. The provisions, the stipulations of that covenant are not permanent. The Abrahamic covenant came first. The Sinai covenant 430 years later. You're not under that covenant anymore. Therefore, you don't have to obey its stipulations. That covenant had a built-in obsolescence. It's not an evil covenant, but that covenant was designed to separate Jews from Gentiles. So the boundary markers argument has some merit to it, right? That covenant, and it worked, didn't it? It worked. Jews and Gentiles were kept separate. The Gentiles, and I think I said this earlier, the Gentiles didn't look at the Jews and say, oh, they think murder's wrong and adultery, even though Gentiles didn't do well at observing all those commands. But they said they don't circumcise. I mean, they do circumcise their kids, and they don't work on Saturday, and they observe these funny food laws, and those segregated them from the Gentiles. But that covenant's over. That covenant was never intended to be permanent. By the way, many, many false teachings have arisen out of a failure to understand that, from Marcion onwards, if you know early church history. Yes, God gave a covenant that he didn't intend to last forever. That is not a sign that God is an inferior God. Right? You with me? That's very important to see. That was God's intention from the beginning. What did the law do in Israel? Well, it separated them from the Gentiles. What's the second thing it did according to these chapters? It revealed their sin. It revealed their sin, didn't it? It showed the world how sinful Israel was. So the law didn't tamp down sin, it exacerbated it. So every non-Christian in the world, if they have any interest in morality and society running on a moral basis, they don't understand this. They don't understand this. Naturally. Now, we do need laws in society. I agree with that, right? We need laws and we need punishments and we need officials. But every liberal Christian thinks the way to transform the world is through laws and commands and instructions. That's how we're going to change people, right? How can we rein in the evil in people's hearts? Laws. And we're a very litigious society, right? We're a very insane society in so many ways, right? On the one hand, we're passing a lot of laws. On the other hand, we're saying it's the autonomous self. Big tension there. But Paul's argument is it doesn't work. It doesn't work. The law in the heart of the unregenerate just produces more sin. So the majority in Israel were unregenerate. He's not talking about the remnant that was righteous, you see? He's not talking about them. He's talking about the majority. And what happened? They couldn't keep the law and they went into exile because they couldn't keep God's law. The law isn't the answer. It isn't the answer. No, the death and resurrection of Jesus is the answer. The gospel is the answer. That's what we'll look at. We're a little bit behind, but we'll catch up. That's what we'll look at Thursday in chapters 5 and 6, and we'll do this. And we'll spend a little bit more time on 3:10 through 14, just unpacking that a little bit at the beginning.